what I think is important to keep in mind, Dana, is that we often look at what's happening on the Israeli side, and we talk about that as being something that is worthy of condemnation. But nobody looks at the other side. There were 26 Palestinians killed, including 9 children, including 3 from one family. And so, why is it that the destruction of targeting a place on one side is considered okay, but then on the other it isn't? This is what I mean by the double standard.
Both are tragic and both have to be reported equally. Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. The violence which began in Jerusalem has spread to all of Israel under bombardment from rockets sent by Palestinians in Gaza. Over 800 rockets fired at city centers inside Israel. Unprecedented attacks. Israel has responded with heavy airstrikes. How did the violence begin, and how does it stop? On this backstory, Palestinian lawyer Diana Buttu makes the case that Israel is the occupier and Palestinians are the victims of apartheid. And an Israeli military affairs correspondent, Ben-Yishai, and another Israeli journalist, Tal Heinrich, discuss how the violence had been brewing for weeks, they say, after provocations by Palestinians and planned stone throwing from Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was then stormed by Israeli soldiers protecting Jewish prayers at the Western Wall. Now, I was based in Jerusalem for Canadian and American TV. I have been to the Gaza Strip 100 times or more. I spent years in the West Bank covering the intifadas, and I've also seen the terror unleashed inside Israel by way of bus bombs and cafes attacked. Both sides will never agree on fair news coverage because they see this through a narrow prism of either you're on their side or you're not. But for the rest of us, this podcast is designed to let you hear both sides and bring you up to speed on what led to this new violence. And we air both sides as journalists are supposed to. You don't have to pick a side because it's very complicated and multi-layered, and both Palestinians and Israelis are masters at torquing the truth to favor their agenda. Don't fall into the trap of seeing one side as the victim and the other as the perpetrator. It's not that neat and tidy and easy. It's not. What they need to do is sit back down at the table and work out a peace process to divorce. But they have failed to do that over and over again. And it's a dangerous, tragic stalemate, and every few years the violence flares up again. And that's where we are now. Joining me now is Diana Buttu, who is a Canadian from Palestinian parents, and she is based in the Middle East. She's in Israel, in Haifa. Hi, Diana.
Hi, nice to see you.
What a distressing time. I mean, as we speak, rockets are flying from Gaza. Israelis have been injured and killed. There are Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and children among them that have been killed by retaliation by Israeli warplanes. This very big riot on the Temple Mount yesterday, several hundred Palestinians injured by Israelis who entered the Al-Aqsa compound, and Jewish prayer goers on the Western Wall had to flee. I mean, it's really seems like the start of a cycle of violence, and a very new and dangerous one.
Well, it depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from, and the way that you've described it. You've described it as life being Jewish Israeli. For them, it's been a period of calm. But if you look at it from the perspective of Palestinians, we haven't had a day of calm in 54 years. And the reason that I say that is because for 54 years, Palestinians have been living under this very brutal military regime. And given that brutal military regime, it's done everything over the course of these 54 years, from stealing land, taking homes, to killing Palestinians, and so on. And even these events that you have mentioned, it all started, Dana, with the very simple decision that the Israelis took to not allow Palestinians to be able to worship during the holy months month of Ramadan. So they prevented worshipers from accessing the Damascus Gate. And from there, they prevented worshipers from going on to the Al-Aqsa compound. And we saw that even on the holiest night in Islam, the 27th night of Ramadan, that the Israeli forces ended up firing stun grenades and live ammunition and so on, including inside the mosque itself. So for Palestinians, this hasn't been a period of calm at all. It has been a period in which Israel has continued to show that they want to continue to deny us our freedom. And that's why it's so important for people to understand the root context of this and the root causes of this, because that's the only way that it can come to an end.
Well, tell me on this latest explosion, I shouldn't even use that word, but the spark seems to have been Sheikh Jarrah and the continued expansion of settlement activities by the Netanyahu government. Is that fair to say?
Correct. Yes. So there were a couple of things that have happened in this latest episode, if you were to say it. Again, I'm looking for the right word. The first is that over the course of the past decade, there has been a plan on the part of the Netanyahu government to try to get rid of Palestinian families who are living in Sheikh Jarrah and replace them instead with Israeli settlers. The deadline for 4 families to be evicted was supposed to be May the 2nd. But as a result, people have been rallying, including members of Knesset, including activists. They've been rallying to try to stop this dispossession, to try to stop this process. And what's happened is that as a result, we've seen that in addition to that the Israelis have also put into place measures to stop Palestinians from worshiping in the old city, in the Haram Sharif on the Al-Aqsa compound. And these two things combined have really been what has led to this massive build of pressure. Add to that the fact that we now have Kahanists. These are people who openly support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. These people are now in the government and have now led marches in Jerusalem in which they are chanting death to Arabs. So a lot of people don't understand what the Kahana High movement was, but I mean, they are a terrorist organization by themselves that have carried out the slaughter of Muslims, for instance, in Hebron, yes,
in a mosque, and they are extremely violent. And I believe that they are treated as a terrorist organization.
Although they're now part of the new Israeli landscape. They've been 7 of their members have been now elected into the Knesset.
So is Netanyahu playing to those right-wing extremists by trying to form a government, and therefore he's always allowed settlement expansion anyway against the calls from the international community, but is he kind of lit a match there to try and form a government, and he's courting these far right-wing parties that once again have this tremendous amount of influence, far more than they should have in the Israeli government?
Yes, absolutely. So, Dana, we've had 4 elections over the course of the past 2 years, and in each round of these elections, Netanyahu has been unable to form a government. This latest ability to try to form a government, he was supposed to have formed a government up until just about a week ago, and was unable to do so. And so now there is talk of somebody else trying to form a government, a different political party trying to form a government. And that's why these decisions have been taken, these decisions being the decision to block access to the Al-Aqsa compound, the decision to proceed ahead with the Sheikh Jarrah dispossession, the decision to allow these death to Arab protest marches and chants throughout the street, the decision for the police to turn a blind eye and not prosecute any of these individuals. This is why we're seeing this happen, because Netanyahu, over the course of his political history, has said 3 things throughout his history. He's either said Iran, Hezbollah, or Gaza. And what he does is when he's in a bit of a crunch, he will either turn up the heat when it comes to Iran, turn up the heat when it comes to Hezbollah, or turn up the heat when it comes to Gaza. And so this time around is no different. The sad part—
In fairness on Gaza, I mean, the Israelis didn't start it this time. These are hundreds of rockets now that are landing in places like Ashkelon and Jerusalem by Islamic Jihad and the Hamas. And I assume you don't feel that that's justified, or you do?
This isn't a question of which came first or what have you. I think the bigger issue is that why is it that these are happening? And it's because we are one people. The Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinians who happen to hold Israeli citizenship, and Israeli actions against one affect the population as a whole. And so this is why it's so important for us to recognize that the key rests in Netanyahu's hand. He has the ability to turn down the heat, but instead he wants to continue to turn up the heat because he wants to be able to look around and say, there's no way you should be having even a so-called centrist in government. I should be the one leading. And this is where I predict things will go.
Was the road paved by the Trump administration? Because in many ways they gave the Netanyahu government kind of a free hand to do whatever the hell they wanted to in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And at least in previous times under the Obama administration, and now hopefully under the Biden administration, they'll start talking about a two-state solution again, and they'll join international calls for a halt of these incendiary settlement expansions.
Yes, absolutely. The Trump administration not only, look, every US administration has coddled Israel and has paved the way for Israel to do whatever it wants. But the Trump administration in particular gave Israel a complete green light to do whatever it wants. And now we're seeing that this Biden administration is either unwilling or unable to scale it back. For example, when the world came out in condemnation of the United States illegally moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, many people were expecting that with the Biden administration, this would be turned around. And yet we've seen that the exact opposite has happened, that senator after senator have come forward and have endorsed this. So yes, the road was definitely paved by the Trump administration. The sad part, though, is that the Biden administration hasn't done anything to unpave it.
Are you surprised by comments like religious Zionist party member of the Knesset, Avi Moaz, who said it's time for the government to end its policies of restraint and start eradicating terror with zero tolerance? Have we seen any restraint? And I mean, that sounds pretty outlandish.
Well, this is the problem, Jane, is that these types of comments go completely unchecked. And in fact, not only do they go unchecked, they get you a lot of votes inside Israel. It's not just him. We've seen members, the journalists who've been calling for the complete flattening of the Gaza Strip. We've seen other journalists who've also called for the death penalty against Palestinians. We've seen politician after politician who built their whole careers on ethnic cleansing policies and demands for loyalty. We've heard politicians call Palestinian mothers snakes. So none of this is really new. This is the way you build your career in Israel, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, and look, there are extremists on both sides, and Hamas is certainly not by any means a moderating force in any of this. But are you? Like, where does this go in terms of, do you think that this is a temporary week and Israel turns up the heat and, they're talking about a sustained bombing campaign in Gaza right now, but, does this blow over, or are we into a new chapter now where Palestinians have gotten very tired? The democratic elections, which, didn't take place, there is a new generation of young Palestinians who want to see this move forward and are frustrated with the existing Palestinian leadership. I mean, what happens now?
It's hard to predict. It's really, really hard to predict. I can tell you that it's ripe for it to continue. And the reason I say this is because just last night alone, being May the 10th, we saw sustained protests not only throughout the entirety of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also inside Palestinian cities inside Israel. A Palestinian man was killed at the hands of an Israeli settler yesterday. We've seen that the police have been cracking down on Palestinian protesters, using very brutal force and oftentimes injuring Palestinians. This is the recipe for its continuation. It's not the recipe for its ending. There is the possibility.
I have to jump in while you're rattling off those numbers, right? At the same time, I don't want to appear to be not neutral in this interview. And that there are over 80 Israelis that have been injured, reportedly, as close to a dozen buildings in Ashdod, Ashkelon are hit by rockets. One of the buildings was a school. I mean, you can't justify the violence on either side.
What I think is important to keep in mind, Dana, is that we often look at what's happening on the Israeli side, and we talk about that as being something that is worthy of condemnation. But nobody looks at the other side. There were 26 Palestinians killed, including 9 children, including 3 from one family. And so, why is it that the destruction of targeting a place on one side is considered okay, but then on the other it isn't? This is what I mean by the double standard.
Both are tragic, and both have to be reported equally.
Yes, and one is done by a state, and the other is not done by a state. That's why I think it's so important. As people who are involved in journalism, your task is to hold the state to account. It's also to hold the others to account as well. But the weight of state, it certainly carries a much stronger weight than that of people who are demanding their freedom and seeking it.
When you were in law school, I hate to do this to you, but I was reporting on the Oslo Peace Accords, and there were these moments and these glimmers of real hope between the two sides. And most importantly, there was an Israeli left who really believed in the peace process. I know.
Dana, the Israeli left
dating myself.
Go. Yes.
The left is gone. And
yes.
the more, but I mean, some of that evaporated with bus bombings and bombings in Tel Aviv, cafes, and I mean, some pretty horrible violence that I had to cover, and I will never forget. But how do you, if both sides just keep ramping it up, how do you bring back an Israeli peace movement and a left? Because they're necessary to pull, to push the right wingers aside in the Israeli government somehow and bring Israel back to the negotiating table. Are they not?
No, because
there you go. What the hell do I?
I'll explain why. Because the Israeli left that existed at the time was not really a left wing. It was a left wing that wanted to have peace, but also wanted to have occupation. And when the time came that they had to make a decision about whether they were going to fight against occupation or fight against Palestinians, they chose to fight against Palestinians. And this is why what I think is much more important now is that I don't believe that change is going to come from within Israel. I think that change is going to come from outside of Israel when Israel is forced to pay a price for continuing to maintain an apartheid regime. That's the only time that it's going to change. Just in the same way, and you'll remember this from the days of reporting, just in the same way that the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement brought change to an apartheid South Africa, so too it can happen here. The difference is that the world is not willing to open its eyes yet, or they haven't yet opened its eyes yet when it comes to Israel. But it's slowly happening. We see that even massive human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch are calling it for what it is. They're calling it and labeling it apartheid. And they too are calling and pushing for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And they recognize that violence is simply a symptom. It's not the disease. The disease is the fact that Palestinians have been denied their freedom for all of these years.
What do you say to the Biden administration? I mean, it's pretty important because of all the countries that have a lot of influence on Israel, what should they be doing right now to, first of all, calm this down, and second of all, try to revive a peace process of some kind, because there have been no talks at all?
Well, Dana, I don't know if you saw this latest by Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, who, in the words of one of my friends, engaged in word salad. He had a hard time condemning Israeli action. He didn't say that Palestinians are entitled to security, and so on. And so I think if the Biden administration wants to not be the laughingstock of the world, which is now what it's becoming on this issue, that they will recognize that there is an occupier and an occupied, and they'll start putting pressure on the occupier rather than on the occupied. This system of simply giving Israel carte blanche has got to end. And you can imagine if it had been the opposite, Dana, if it had been Palestinian police force who had been shooting stun grenades into any of the Jewish holy sites. You can imagine the condemnations that would have happened. But when it comes to Israel, they're not doing it. So I think that what they should be doing now is reassessing these 25 years of diplomacy that they've had and ask themselves whether these years of diplomacy have garnered them anything other than making them a side that is ridiculed.
Diana, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Ron Ben-Yishai, who is a veteran affairs military correspondent in Israel. He is also someone who writes for Yediot Ahronot newspaper and also for Ynet. Hi, Ron.
Hi.
Ron, this has escalated very quickly. I mean, we've seen conflict between Israelis and Palestinians on the Temple Mount and around Al-Aqsa Mosque before. How would you compare what's going on now with, what happened when Sharon did his famous walk and another intifada, and even the one in 1996, I think it was, when Israelis tunneled under the Temple Mount, and then that started a lot of violence and a lot of conflict. I mean, this is in another league. Why would Israel risk international condemnation, because that's how it plays outside of Israel, for entering the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque and firing tear gas and rubber bullet and injuring hundreds of people? What was the point?
I don't think that there was a point. I'm sorry to say, but they started the whole thing. The Palestinians started the whole thing, and there was an accumulation of circumstances that neither was intended to create an havoc, but altogether coming together with a political crisis in Israel and political crisis in the Palestinian camp when Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, canceled the elections there, which his opponents, the Hamas, was supposed to win. That's why he canceled it. And the Hamas became very angry because they realized that they lost an opportunity to become the governing element of the Palestinian nation, and there was a unjustified vacating of houses by Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, and there was a little violation of the status quo. Nothing serious, but
apparently pretty serious. But Netanyahu will once again shoulder a lot of blame for continuing on with settlement activity, and this is an expansion in East Jerusalem, which is largely a Palestinian area. Surely he is playing. You talk about Hamas playing to the street on the Palestinian side. Surely he is playing to the religious parties by allowing people to go into Sheikh Jarrah and take over some of the Palestinian housing.
These are not Palestinian houses. They are on Jewish property. It is a complicated judicial or juristic problem because Sheikh Jarrah was previously named Shchunat Shimon HaTzadik, and it was owned by Jews in Jerusalem before the 48 war. And when the Jordanians occupied East Jerusalem, they took this land, built houses on it, and rented it to Palestinians, provided they will give up their refugee status. So they are, as a matter of fact, settled or housed or are renting houses on a land that is not theirs. But there is another side of it. because Israel doesn't allow Arabs who lost their property in West Jerusalem to get their property back. But the court in Jerusalem allowed Jews to own again, to re-own the land that was owned by them before the 48.
Okay, that's a really important explanation, but would you agree that was the spark? Certainly.
No, that was not the spark. The spark was, if you are talking about the spark, was when two Arabs slept on the cheek and photographed it and put it on Instagram. Jews in the Jerusalem tram, in Jerusalem subway. And they did it, and they photographed it, and they spread it in the Instagram as a show of how they can treat religious Jews. They simply, you see on the video that two Arab youngsters, two Palestinian youngsters, are approaching two yeshiva bochers sitting in the train.
These are religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews?
Yes. You see the payas and the hat and the everything. And they slap them on the cheek and then laugh, photograph it, and next station they simply get out with no punishment. And they boast in the video, this is how you should treat Jews. So with all my respect to the international public opinion, the international public opinion is misled, maybe intentionally, by journalists or media people who are not very thorough in fact-finding.
Well, Ron, surely you're not. Surely, let me ask you. Surely you are not drawing a parallel between slapping somebody in the face in a subway and the storming of one of the most religious holy sites to Muslims by Israeli soldiers firing tear gas and rubber bullets.
Well, first of all, Dana, it's been a long time since you have been to the Middle East. And in the Middle East, what is serious and what is not serious is not determined by the measurement in which you use force. Secondly,
well, I think it's been 5 years, by the way, but if you want to say that's a long time.
Secondly, what you maybe also forgot is that Al-Aqsa Mosque is situated over the Wailing Wall. And when Jews prayed in the Wailing Wall, they used Al-Aqsa Mosque as a shelter to throw stones and Molotov cocktails on the Jews who were praying in the Wailing Wall.
I think that's an important piece of geography that a lot of people don't understand, because the attacks on religious. Let me finish. The attacks on religious Jews in front of the Western Wall are many times launched from the Temple Mount, and that's with stone throwing and whatever else they throw. That is when Israeli police will then enter the Temple Mount complex.
No, they tried to block the doors of the Temple Mount so they cannot throw stones. But the people inside put barricades well prepared beforehand to prevent the police from reaching them, while leaving a space to let the stones and the Molotov cocktails go down to the Western Wall. So, and then they even ignited one of the trees near the mosque. They simply put gasoline on it and ignited it in order to produce a picture to be seen in London as a fire burning in the mosque, in order to ignite the whole Muslim world to do it. Listen, Dana, I don't think that Israel is a country of righteous men, and I think that our extreme right, and there is extreme Israeli right, and the extremists are as violent and as terroristic as their terrorists. But in this case, it was cynically used by an Islamic radical movement, the Hamas, with Muslim brothers, to ignite a fire that serves them politically.
And Israel just walks into it every time. I mean, they're very good at understanding and accusing the Palestinians of setting a trap, and they step in it every time.
This is absolutely right, what you said. That Israel, without thinking, without preparing, the Ramadan occurs every year. And you know that it is a sense, this remark is absolutely right. Israel walked into this trap open-eyed, obsessed with the political crisis that we have in Israel. You know that we are facing fifth election session in 2 years. Even France before World War II was not as bad as we are, or Italy after the war. And Netanyahu simply let it go.
So the religious Zionist party
and the unexperienced police commander and the commander of the Jerusalem region, who also is inexperienced, that gives you a
sets the stage for disaster. Sets the stage for disaster.
Exactly.
Religious Zionist Party MK member of the Knesset, Avi Moaz, you can correct my pronunciation, is saying now today, it's time for the government to end its policies of restraint and start eradicating terror with zero tolerance. Is this restraint? When you look at what
yes, it is restraint. He's right. I'm not a supporter of the religious party that Avi Maoz is representing, to say the least. But yes, the police exercise a lot of restraint, and that is why I say that nobody was not killed. Because if the police didn't use restraint, as in when Arik Sharon mounted the Temple Mount, and as in 96, the police would have used, in this case, in cases like this, firearms, and the police did not.
What about Gaza? Is that restraint, carrying over 100 airstrikes overnight into the Gaza Strip, as Palestinian Hamas were firing more than 200 rockets?
I think that this is not only the beginning, and it should get worse, because Hamas interpreted Israeli lenience, and because the Israeli army was leading a policy that says if the Gazans will live better, will have better economy, we shall help them with their COVID efforts, and we shall do this, there will be a sort of a ceasefire. And they were wrong, because the Hamas interpreted this as a weakness. I'm sorry to say, it is unlike everything the international media wants to believe. But
well, I want to defend the international media, because I can tell you what, a lot of this is driven by social media. And what you have on, yesterday in the last 24 hours is just social media pumping out women crying and screaming in a mosque, and young men cowering from gunfire, from rubber bullet fire and flash grenades. And you know how that's going to play on social media. You can't blame international media for all of that.
Yes, I can, and I'll tell you why. Because the same social media helped a lunatic like Donald Trump become the president of the United States and a world leader.
All right, now we're really taking a right-hand turn here. I'm not going to.
No. It is the same thing that we are living in a post-truth era.
I agree with you.
What the media, the international, so to say,
it's certainly disinformation.
Yes, not finding the facts, and the facts are not what you see on the social media. On the social media,
there was some factual displays on social media, but it's a very narrow window. It's not showing you the large picture. Probably every cameraman is guilty of that at times, but I mean, clearly it didn't show how it started, and it didn't show how it's going to end. But can I ask you now, when you say it's going to get worse, how does it get worse?
I hope it will get worse. I in this case, I hope that the Gazans will listen. They shot missiles on Jerusalem. Did you hear about it?
Yes.
Yes, good. Because a lot of people miss it. One more fact that you want to know. 1/3 of the missiles they shot yesterday, the Gazans, the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, fell on the grounds of the Gaza Strip, killing Gazans, which means Palestinians. Not all the Palestinians that were killed yesterday were killed by the Hamas rockets.
And how does it get worse? Why do you hope it gets worse, and how?
Because I think that the Hamas should get a lesson, should be taught a lesson, and a lesson that it will not forget for many years. And this lesson...
You start talking about a ground invasion again.
Pardon? No. Today you can do it without even without collateral, as much as possible without collateral damage, because of the advancement of intelligence technologies and precise munitions. And I understand one or two things about these things, and I think that the evil people will get punished, and the not involved people will suffer as less as possible damage or casualties.
You're talking about some kind of sustained air campaign with drones, etc., where they really lay siege to Gaza.
Not necessarily air campaign. There will be some munitions from the ground. But look at what happened in Azerbaijan, and you see that the land campaign, the ground campaign, was not the decisive thing. It was done by munitions from the air, from the ground, and in this case, in the Gaza case, it will be also from the sea.
Yesterday, when I talked to you, the rocket fire hadn't started yet, and you told me on the telephone you thought this probably didn't have legs. It wouldn't last long, because it was a conflict at that point just between Palestinians who were praying in Jerusalem and the police in Jerusalem. This is now entering a very different chapter. You believe that we're into a much more serious conflict now.
Yes, because the IDF explicitly says, I intend to keep going until I will reach my goals. And the goals are taking as much as possible from the fighting fighting capabilities of the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. B, to destroy all the infrastructure that enables the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad to rehabilitate their fighting capabilities. And 3, to create a deterrence effect that will prevent them from wanting to go into the same escalation again. And there is a 4th target, not to lose the legitimacy that the international public opinion gives Israel to defend itself. Because yesterday Hamas crossed a real red line. It shot missiles on Jerusalem intentionally. It gave an ultimatum to Israel that they knew that Israel cannot even think, which means to relinquish Jerusalem. Okay. And they shot salvos till now over 200 missiles to Israel. Luckily enough, and this is a new phenomenon too, 1/3 of those missiles fell into the Gaza Strip itself, killing Palestinians. But this is a side effect that should be remembered, but not taken too seriously. What I say is that Hamas changed its posture. Instead of thinking of its own population as they did until now, saying, okay, let's work together to get some sort of an arrangement of living side by side, not liking each other too much, not even talking directly to each other.
Well, I have to interrupt you. Come on, that's Hamas. That's not PLO. I mean, I can't imagine Hamas ever saying, "Come on, let's live together." And
Hamas did, and Netanyahu's big mistake was that Netanyahu preferred Hamas, believing that the tiger can become a pussycat, on Abu Mazen, who is really not violent. The Likud government described Abu Mazen as a terrorist and violent guy, and Hamas as people whom you can talk. We even bribed Hamas, though not with Israeli money, but with Qatari money. Do you know it? Qatar used to send every month $30 million in a suitcase, cash, to the Gaza Strip, which Hamas paid to the low-income citizens that they had. They didn't take it as
well. That's why Hamas just keeps getting more and more popular, because I mean Netanyahu strengthens their hand at every turn. Exactly. I mean, even these rockets, even if they get beaten up by Israel now, they will still be seen to be standing up for Palestinians both in the West Bank and in Jerusalem and in Gaza, and they will reap some reward from it. So short term, they'll feel pain, but
it depends. Look, it's short time. I remember that in the beginning, I'll tell you a little story. In the beginning of the Second Intifada, which you remember probably as the suicide bomber Intifada. People
horribly
loaded in buses, in restaurants, everywhere.
Horrible.
And it was really horrible.
Yeah.
One day, a colleague of mine said, if they will go on like this for 2 more weeks, Israel will not exist anymore. People will simply leave and go to Europe or to the United States. This is one of my colleagues who is now serving as a military correspondent of one of the Israeli television. And I said to him, we've seen worse, and Israel will not disappear so quickly. And this is what I'm telling you now. The Hamas had yesterday, yes, a serious and big how shall I say, media conquest. But it is short-living. They have already 24 of their militants, of their activists in Gaza, fighters, killed, and there will be more.
Ron Ben-Yishai, always insightful and good to talk to you. Thank you, Ron.
My pleasure.
Joining me now from New York is Tal Heinrich, who I know is a journalistic colleague, but Tal is also an Israeli journalist who has just come back from Israel. And Tal, I mean, what a incredible, 24, 48 hours now. We've watched the violence on Temple Mount, and then now these strikes in Gaza in retaliation for rocket attacks. It seems like it is only going to escalate.
So it seems, yes, very, very unfortunate situation. I was just there 2 weeks ago, and the country was celebrating going back to routine, reopening the economy and everything. You went on the major streets of Tel Aviv, you couldn't find a spot at a restaurant or a bar. 2 weeks fast forward to now, and it's almost war. And I'm saying almost war because we're still not calling it this way in Israel. So over the last 24 hours, I just read that 630 rockets were fired from Gaza to Israel, which is crazy. We haven't seen such, intense fire since the days of the 2014 war. And even back then, Dana, we didn't see as many rockets fired at one single day. So sirens went off in Israeli communities surrounding the Gaza Strip, but also in big cities in the south, like in Ashkelon, Ashdod, and even as far as Jerusalem, which is quite rare, as you know, you've been covering the conflict for a long time there. And today, two Israeli women were killed in Ashkelon. I think that about 90 or 100 people have been injured or suffered from anxiety. And were evacuated to hospitals. And on the Palestinian side, the Palestinians, so far, they've reported more than 26 casualties. Among them, they say, are also children. The IDF said that they killed, I think, at least around 8 to 10 Hamas operatives, but also about 3 Islamic Jihad operatives. And, in Israel, they closed schools yesterday, and also tomorrow, no school, even as far as in Tel Aviv, which really tells you how bad things are.
Why would Israel risk international condemnation, firing tear gas and rubber bullets into Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Well, whether it's, operating in Gaza or firing tear gas and rubber bullets on Al-Aqsa Mosque, I think that Israel cares about the international condemnation just to a certain extent, because at some point they know that no matter what they do, no matter what the result will be, there will be international condemnation. So at some point, Israeli lawmakers, I don't say that they fully ignore it, because the court of public opinion still matters, but they don't really make their calculations solely based on that. The issue with the Temple Mount, as we saw Palestinians basically barricading there also over the night. I think it was 2 days ago when they stockpiled rocks and stones and Molotov cocktails, and they hurled them not only at Israeli security forces, but also at Jewish worshippers that were in the Western Wall. So you know the geography of the area. So the Temple Mount is above, the Western Wall is below. So if you throw something, it goes down.
Yeah, people don't realize how close it is, and the Israeli police normally stay off the Temple Mount and away from Al-Aqsa Mosque. But once trouble starts, once stones start coming down on the area where Jews are praying, then police have, in many different instances, gone inside. I've never seen them firing tear gas. Maybe it's happened, and shock grenades into a mosque like that, into Al-Aqsa. And it certainly
I agree with you.
Well,
listen, it's not a good
international social media.
It's not a good look for anyone, by the way. Also, I'm reading Arabic, so I'm following, Arab social media as well. And what's interesting is that on one hand, it's not a good look for Israel to be firing at a holy site, which is also, by the way, holy for Jews, the holiest place, we should say, in the Jewish religion, and the third holiest site for Sunni Muslims, but also Muslims, more specifically Sunni Muslims. We can talk about it later. But it's not a good look for Israel, and it's not a good look for Palestinians to be, stockpiling all of these rocks and ammunitions inside the mosque. Either way you look at it, it's not a good look.
So I think a lot of people will have their views on that and what happened. And Israelis will say that they were justified in going into the compound, and Palestinians and friends of Palestinians will say it was uncalled for violence. But people will see the Gaza Strip as something very different. I mean, actually firing hundreds of rockets into Israel, I don't think there are very many states that would not respond when rockets are falling on your cities.
I agree, but I can name one, Saudi Arabia. I mean, and they do respond, as we know in Yemen. It's just something that jumped out to me, but they've been containing the situation for a while. So speaking again about Israel, yes, it's a reality. It has been just a reality. Now we're talking about 630 rockets in just over 24 hours, but for a while you've been the sirens were going off and. Yeah. And it became some sort of routine, just as you hear about, I don't know, gunfire in Chicago over the weekend. So we're getting the push notifications in Israel that siren in the communities surrounding Gaza, and you just you ignore it. It became a routine. It's something that the Israeli population, especially in the south, is living with. But now
and tens of thousands of people are pushed
escalated.
Into bomb shelters, right? Tens of thousands
right,
of Israelis
right.
have
And
to
now,
go to bomb shelters.
Exactly. And once this happens, once Gaza's in the picture, once Hamas starts operating, then I feel that the tide is somewhat turning in terms of the international, public opinion and the pressure. I mean, we saw it, I think, even in the response from the Biden administration. Before Gaza started firing, then it was some sort of a call for de-escalation on both sides, right? And the Biden administration had put pressure on Israel to reroute, or rather cancel, the flag parade of the Jerusalem Day and postpone the court hearing for the over the home ownership dispute in the neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And this is what happened. Israel tried to de-escalate it, as the Biden administration had asked. But now, once you see the rockets being fired from Gaza, then the administration is taking a different tone already.
I mean, there's criticism.
More one-sided.
There is criticism within Israel of how the Jerusalem police handled this, and how they bumbled and stumbled into, in many ways, a trap that was set for them by the Palestinians. Let me ask you, could you smell any of this coming in terms of Netanyahu? Has been struggling to form a government. He has increasingly had to court the right-wing parties who have been pushing settlement expansion, including into Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, could you feel it coming? And is this a product of Netanyahu's politics?
Oh, I definitely don't see it as a product of Netanyahu's politics. Some of the right will tell you so, not only on the left, because they would say that Netanyahu chose the strategy of containing the conflict instead of, eliminating Hamas once and for all. So that's the criticism coming from the right against Netanyahu. But then you have the criticism coming from the left, and they see everything. But Dana, it's very hard to differentiate between what's really going on and the obsession that some people in Israel have towards Netanyahu after so many years in power. Some people in Israel, honestly, they wake up in the morning, there's no coffee in the fridge, so they blame it on Netanyahu. I mean, it has reached there already. I get what you're saying, because what's happening now is definitely also influencing the attempt by Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett to form a government that, without Netanyahu for the first time in so many years, over a decade. And this is a hardship for them now, because either way, they need a support of the Arab parties for such a government. And right now they can't do it. Plus, some ministers from some rather members of Knesset from Naftali Bennett's party, which is a right-wing party, they're already saying that they will not support the government. So I don't know if they will. I mean, there's still enough time. I think about 22 days that the mandate is still in Yair Lapid's hands. So, but I can't guarantee that they will have 61 votes for a coalition government. So I get what you're saying. This is playing out in favor of Netanyahu in terms of Israeli politics, but it would have I could see it brew. I saw it brewing, I would say, for weeks. I mean, this conflict, the flare up comes as no surprise.
In what way?
So we'll start with what happened in Jerusalem. I mean, in Jerusalem for weeks, there have been protests that started following this TikTok that has gone viral of a Palestinian punching an Orthodox Jew on the subway. And then everyone was on the streets for I don't know, a few weeks. So you had Jewish Orthodox protesting, you had Palestinians also protesting, and clashes. Now, keep in mind that all of that is happening around the Eid, around during Ramadan. You also had Jerusalem Day yesterday, which was a celebration of the reunification of Jerusalem, which is also very, it's a fragile day in Israel. Let's put it this way. And you had the court hearing date, the original one for this dispute, the discussion over the Sheikh Jarrah home ownership. And everything happened in parallel. Plus, Mahmoud Abbas had canceled the Palestinian elections. And the Israelis are saying that he was also interested in shifting away public attention from that fact and sort of push to ignite the surface once again. So you have Netanyahu in a fragile political position. You have Abbas in a fragile political position. You have a viral TikTok. You have a dispute over home ownership, the Ramadan and Jerusalem Day, everything all together. I mean,
my head hurts.
It's not a real surprise, right?
It is never simple.
And a change of
so many
right, and a change of administration in the United States, and a new administration in the United States, which is also, I wouldn't say but it's part of the story.
It seems to me part of the story now is also the strengthening of Hamas, because that's probably why Abbas didn't want to hold elections, because they're worried about Hamas taking even more influence in the West Bank, just not in the Gaza Strip. And now they are seen, despite any, I think, ridiculous talk of Israel saying they're going to get rid of Hamas. I mean, there's no way to get rid of Hamas in Gaza, certainly not by bombing them. And now they will appear to be the defender of Palestinians firing these rockets. I mean, it seems every time there is a conflict, there is just a growth of extremism, and Hamas does better. Would you agree? There's a question in there.
No, I totally agree with you. What I would say that, some people in Israel wish to topple Hamas in Gaza, but others will admit that Hamas in Gaza is actually an interest of Israel, because and the conflict between the Palestinian factions is also an interest of Israel, because then it's very easy to point out and say, well, they're not even speaking in one voice, so who do you want us to negotiate with, right? Because you have Hamas, you have Islamic Jihad, they're not aligned at times. And then you have Fatah in the West Bank, and, the fate of Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, it's also, it's always fragile. So
last question
I would say that it's even.
Go ahead,
yes.
Finish.
No, I would say that it's even an interest of Israel to still have Hamas in Gaza. It's also a good talking point vis-a-vis the Arab world, right?
Let me ask you, is there a left in Israel? Are there, or after the 90s, where the Oslo peace accords fell apart? I mean, we don't have to go back that far, but the violence that ensued in engaging Palestinians in a peace process. And then now, fast forward to even today, where you have rockets landing all over Israel. Is there a left that talks peace anymore, or it's certainly not this week?
It's a good question. I would say, well, there's no doubt that the Israeli population has shifted rightwards following, the bitter memories from the 1990s, the failing of the Oslo Accord, the buses exploding. That's the period that you were in Israel. You were covering Israel, right? So you remember, and it's a bitter national memory. And many people who were on the left, or that openly say right now that they are still on the left and that they support a so-called two-state solution, are also not as naive that they were back then. Back then they also pressed Yitzhak Rabin to negotiate with Assad and return the Golan Heights. That's not even a talking point for nobody in Israel nowadays. So you see how things have changed. Things have changed. I think that many people on the left, I don't know if you saw, there's a very fascinating book by Dr. Einat Wilf and I forgot the name, Adi. He was an editor for Haaretz, and they wrote this book. It's called The War of Return. There are two left-wing pundits. She was a member of Knesset on behalf of the center to left-wing parties, and they came to they were disappointed lefties from the 1990s, and they decided to investigate what really happened, what went so wrong, why after so many years of talking peace, talking about two-state solutions, like the Palestinians are still not agreeing, or there's still not a solution. And they came to the conclusion that every time when they talk to Palestinians from all walks of life, and they peeled the layers of the discussion, it always comes back to the so-called right of return, and that the Palestinians are using this term, the right of return, as
Right,
a call for an elimination
is one of the Palestinian demands that, in addition to having access to Jerusalem and a seamless Palestinian state, the right of return are Palestinians who left in war and fled in war in 48 and 67 and are still in refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere, that they would have the right to come back. And there are many of them. And Israel says, of course, we could not take that many people back. So.
Right. So their research discovered that is the main hurdle, not Jerusalem, not settlement, that the so-called right of return, this concept of Palestinians, it that is still there, and UNRWA is also fueling it by part. That's the
United
main
Nations
hurdle,
Refugee Agency. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for clarifying every term that I say. But they have discovered that the right of return, this dream that one day they will be able to return to this territory, and it prevents them from realizing that there's a Jewish state that is there to stay. And I think some people on the left have realized it, and people are just waiting for a Palestinian recognition that the Jewish state is going nowhere. I think it's still not there. We're still not there. I mean, it will take time. And what Netanyahu has been trying to do, honestly, his long-term strategy has been to, create some sort of a partnership with other countries in the Middle East, with Iran as a shared enemy, and through that to put pressure on Hamas and on Hezbollah and the Palestinians until, you reach some realization on the other side that the Jewish state is there to stay.
Well, a lot of Palestinians do recognize the Jewish state, but it's an interesting point that you just made, is that in many ways, the Palestinian conflict has always been the driver in all of the Middle East relationships for both America and for Israel. And then they were able to kind of bypass all of that recently, making peace elsewhere. And I would say now the clock just went backwards with this conflict the last few days, that in fact, this pushes the Palestinian-Israeli conflict back to the forefront again. And a lot of nations will be uncomfortable engaging with Israel, certainly while there's this level of violence. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree, and also, again, I'm going back to the change of administration here in the U.S. and the trendy ideology right now on the progressive left in the U.S. I would say, and around the world, because it's rising, that everything in the world is a clash between, two classes of oppressed and oppressors. And if you're strong, you must be the oppressor. And Israel is strong in the Middle East, so they always must be the oppressor. So I think that is also.
There's the term apartheid, right? That the Palestinians push very successfully, even with human rights organizations.
Well, yeah, that's exactly, that's their narrative. I wouldn't say that. Yeah, of course, as an Israeli, I don't see it, because I don't see the apartheid also that they're talking about, especially in Israel, because you have Israeli Arabs, who live, or other Israeli minorities that are Muslim that live in Israel, and you don't see any kind of discrimination against them, which is the. So that's the Palestinian narrative, but it's I think that the trendy ideology right now of the so-called woke is helping in pushing this narrative that works against Israel.
And they're going to be very successful with some of the images of the last few days, Tal. Tal Heinrich, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana.
And that's our backstory on Israeli-Palestinian violence. U.S. President Joe Biden has chosen conflict management in the Middle East versus conflict resolution. In other words, he's decided not to attempt peacemaking between Israel and Palestinians because other presidents have failed. It's not exactly bold leadership. His predecessor, Donald Trump, completely aggravated the conflict by choosing to support Israel while ignoring Palestinians, and pretended to float peace deals that were land annexations and non-starters. I leave you with a wise quote from Martin Indyk, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel and a former special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Quote, "The problem with the Middle East is you can try and turn your back on it, but it won't turn its back on you." Unquote. The conflict just keeps coming, and it's in everyone's interest to try and settle it. And I might add, there are many peaceful Palestinians who want to live with Israel in peace. And the same goes for Israelis who believe in peacemaking. Unfortunately, they are drowned out by extremists on both sides. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to Backstory and share this podcast.